It had been a quiet evening for Emily when the letter arrived. The sunset bathed her small apartment in a soft, fading light, and she was settling into her routine when the old, weathered envelope slipped through the mail slot. It caught her eye immediately. There was something unsettling about it. The thick parchment was stained yellow with age, and the ink appeared to be scrawled hastily, as if written in a rush. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name written on the front, Emily Sinclair. It wasn't just the unfamiliar handwriting that sent a chill down her spine. It was the name beneath her own, the name she hadn't seen or heard in over 2 decades. Aunt Margot. Emily hadn't thought about her Aunt Margot in years. The woman had vanished when she was just a child, leaving behind no trace, no explanations, just whispers of strange happenings at her secluded mansion far from town. She was the family's black sheep, the one no one talked about openly. Even as a child, Emily had sensed the discomfort that Aunt Margot's name brought to family gatherings. Her hands trembled as she tore open the envelope. The letter inside was brief, but the words carried an eerie weight. Dearest Emily, I've been gone too long, and I'm afraid time is running out. You must come to me. There are things you need to know, things I must show you before it's too late. You're the only one I can trust with this. I will be waiting for you at the house. Margot. The words "before it's too late" lingered in Emily's mind, twisting her stomach with a sense of foreboding. What could possibly be so urgent after all these years? What could Aunt Margot want with her now? Against her better judgment, Emily found herself unable to resist the pull of the letter. It was as if the past had suddenly clawed its way out of the grave, dragging her towards something she wasn't prepared to face. The mention of the house filled her with a creeping dread. She had heard the stories, the hushed conversations between relatives, the fearful glances whenever Aunt Margot's estate was mentioned. The mansion was a place no one visited anymore. Isolated in a remote part of the countryside, it had become a place of dark rumors. People spoke of strange lights at night, ghostly figures in the windows, and eerie sounds that echoed through the woods surrounding it. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had no choice. The letter was almost beckoning her, compelling her to seek answers. She packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, and set off the very next morning. The drive was long and winding, with the trees along the narrow road growing denser the farther she went. The sun dipped lower as the hours passed, the daylight fading into a gloomy twilight. Emily's GPS signal faltered as she approached her destination, the small screen blinking in and out of service. Soon, she was navigating purely by instinct, following the old, nearly forgotten directions she vaguely remembered from her childhood visits. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving through the endless forest, the trees gave way to a clearing. There, standing like a sentinel of forgotten times, was Margot's mansion. It loomed over the landscape, its dark, weather-beaten facade towering against the sky, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow it back into the ground. Vines curled up its stone walls, and the once elegant windows were clouded with grime. The mansion seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, its heavy doors slightly ajar, as if they had been waiting for her. Emily hesitated, her heartbeat quickening. A gust of wind sent the trees swaying ominously, their branches scraping against one another with a sound that reminded her of bones grinding together. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the mansion's dark, cavernous entryway. The moment she did, she felt it, the sense that she was no longer alone, that the house was watching her, waiting for something. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and the silence that greeted her was absolute. Emily's footfalls echoed unervingly in the vast, empty space, each step feeling like a small trespass into something forbidden. Suddenly, from deep within the shadows of the house, she heard it, a soft, unmistakable whisper. Her name, Emily. Her blood ran cold. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as the whisper echoed through the cold, dark air of the mansion's entryway. The sound had been faint, almost fragile, but unmistakably real. Her name, spoken by a voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. There had to be a logical explanation, a draft through the old walls, the settling of the house, her imagination playing tricks on her. She forced herself to continue deeper into the mansion, her footsteps hesitant, her senses on high alert. The grand foyer stretched out before her, its once opulent features now reduced to a decaying shadow of their former glory. Dust coated every surface, and the heavy, faded drapes hung limp around towering windows that let in only a dim, gray light. An enormous chandelier, its crystals dulled by time, loomed overhead like the skeleton of some forgotten beast. In the middle of the foyer stood a staircase that spiraled upward, disappearing into the shadows above. Emily's eyes followed its curve, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, something or someone retreating into the darkness. She shook her head. It had to be her imagination. It had to be. A part of her wanted to turn back, to get in her car and drive as far from this place as possible. But the letter, her aunt's cryptic, desperate words, echoed in her mind. You must come to me before it's too late. Too late for what? Clutching her bag a little tighter, Emily crossed the foyer and headed down one of the side corridors. The air grew colder as she ventured further into the house, the silence almost unbearable. She was sure the mansion had been grand once, but now it felt like a tomb. The walls seemed to press in on her, as if the house itself was alive, watching her every move. As she passed a series of old portraits hanging on the walls, she stopped, her eyes drawn to one in particular. It was a painting of a woman, her face sharp and striking, with eyes that seemed to follow Emily no matter where she stood. Emily's stomach twisted as she recognized the figure, her Aunt Margot, though much younger than she remembered. The woman in the painting was beautiful, but severe, her expression unreadable. Beneath the portrait, a plaque read, Margot Sinclair, Lady of the House. Lady of the House? That title hadn't been mentioned in any family stories. Emily had always known her aunt as a recluse, a strange woman who'd cut ties with the family. The house's grandiosity, the formality of the title, it all seemed out of place, as if there was more to Aunt Margot than Emily had ever been told. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud crash from somewhere deeper in the house. Emily jumped, her heart racing. The noise had come from down the corridor, perhaps a room just around the corner. She hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or flee, but the inexplicable pull of the house kept her feet moving forward. As she rounded the corner, she saw it. An old door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, its frame splintered as if something, or someone, had forced it open. Slowly, cautiously, she approached and pushed it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit parlor, the furniture covered in dusty sheets. A large mirror hung on the far wall, its surface cracked, distorting the reflection of the room in strange, twisted ways. But it wasn't the mirror or the broken door that drew her attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. Her breath caught in her throat. A woman stood there, her back to Emily, dressed in an old-fashioned black gown that looked like it had been plucked from a different century. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and she stood unnaturally still, as though she were frozen in time. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. Aunt Margot. The woman didn't move, didn't even seem to register Emily's presence. For a moment, Emily thought perhaps she was a statue, a trick of the dim light. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the woman's head began to turn, just enough for Emily to catch a glimpse of her face. It wasn't Margot. It wasn't even human. The face that met Emily's gaze was twisted and grotesque, the skin pale and stretched tight over hollow bones. The eyes were sunken, black pits, and the mouth hung open in a silent scream. Emily stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. She blinked, and the woman was gone, vanished as though she had never been there. Panic surged through her, and she backed out of the room, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste. Her hands fumbled for the doorframe, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The shadows in the hallway seemed to grow darker, closing in on her from all sides. The walls creaked, groaning like a living thing. Desperate to get her bearings, Emily turned and ran back toward the foyer, her mind racing. What had she just seen? Was it some kind of hallucination? A ghost? The house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy now, its once stillness replaced by a low, constant hum, as if it were alive and breathing. When she finally reached the foyer, she collapsed against the base of the grand staircase, gasping for air. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the oppressive silence. The whisper returned, more insistent this time. "Emily." She clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head, but the voice only grew louder, more urgent. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a plea. "Emily, upstairs." She didn't want to obey. Every instinct in her body screamed to leave, to get out of this cursed place while she still could. But something, some terrible force, urged her onward. With trembling legs, she rose and turned toward the staircase. As she placed her hand on the cold, iron railing, she felt the house shudder beneath her, as if it were waking from a long slumber. And then, from the darkness above, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, someone or something was waiting for her. The footsteps echoed through the mansion, each one deliberate, reverberating through the wooden floors like a death knell. Emily's breath hitched as she stared up the staircase, her eyes wide and searching the shadows above. Her mind raced. Was it Aunt Margot? Or something else entirely? Despite the terror gnawing at her, some unseen force urged her forward, pushing her feet up the steps. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, the chill sinking deep into her bones. The creaking of the house seemed louder now, almost as if it were whispering secrets just out of reach. Each step felt like a final decision, a point of no return. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in front of her, long and narrow, the doors to various rooms lining either side. The light here was dim, barely illuminating the old, faded wallpaper. At the far end, a single door stood slightly ajar, a faint light flickering from within. That's where the footsteps had come from. She was sure of it. Emily swallowed hard and made her way down the hallway, her footsteps cautious. As she passed by the closed doors, she could feel a strange presence behind them, as though something or someone was watching her from the other side. But none of the doors opened. None of them revealed what they hid. She stopped in front of the half-open door at the end of the hall. The light inside flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows across the threshold. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob for a moment before she pushed it open. Inside, the room was unlike the rest of the decaying mansion. It was smaller, more intimate, with an old writing desk against one wall and shelves lined with dusty books. The source of the flickering light was a single candle burning low, its flame dancing in the draft that seemed to come from nowhere. But what drew Emily's attention most was the figure sitting at the desk. It was Aunt Margot. She sat hunched over, her back to the door, her long, dark hair hanging limply down her back. Her shoulders moved slightly, as though she was writing something, scribbling furiously, her quill scratching against paper. "Aunt Margot." Emily's voice was shaky, barely a whisper. She wasn't sure she wanted to disturb whatever scene was unfolding before her, but she had to know. She had to speak to her. Margot didn't respond. Her hand continued to move, the quill scratching at an unnatural speed, faster and faster. Emily stepped closer, her stomach twisting in knots. She could hear the sound of Margot's breath, shallow, strained, as though she were struggling to get air. When Emily finally reached her aunt, she placed a hand on her shoulder. The moment her fingers touched the fabric of Margot's dress, the quill stopped moving. The room fell silent, as though the air itself had been sucked out of the space. Emily's hand trembled as she leaned over to see what her aunt had been writing. The paper was covered in strange symbols, dark, jagged marks that made no sense, as though the letters were twisted versions of some forgotten language. The ink wasn't just black. It seemed to shimmer, to move slightly, as though it were alive. Before Emily could fully comprehend what she was looking at, Margot's head snapped up, her body stiffening unnaturally. Slowly, her head turned, her neck creaking like an old hinge. When her face finally met Emily's, The breath was stolen from her lungs. Margot's face was a mask of horror, her eyes wide and glassy, her skin pale as death. Her lips were cracked, her mouth hanging open in a soundless scream. But it wasn't the face of someone merely frightened. Margot looked as though she had seen something so terrifying, so unspeakable, that her soul had fled her body. Suddenly, Margot's lips moved, though the rest of her body remained rigid. Her voice was no more than a raspy whisper. "It's too late, you shouldn't have come." Emily recoiled, stepping back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare, but her legs felt like lead. The air in the room had grown thick, oppressive, and she could feel something, someone behind her. Slowly, she turned her head. The figure from the parlor was there, standing in the corner of the room. The same twisted, hollow face, the same black, pitiless eyes. This time, the creature's mouth wasn't hanging open. It was smiling, a cruel, jagged grin that made Emily's skin crawl. As the figure stepped toward her, the walls of the room began to close in, the shadows lengthening, dark tendrils creeping across the floor. The candle flickered wildly, and a low, guttural growl filled the air, as if the house itself were alive, reacting to the creature's presence. Emily tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Her eyes locked onto the creature's, and for a moment, she felt herself slipping, as though being drawn into those dark, endless voids where its eyes should have been. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that whispered of horrors beyond her comprehension. Then, in a burst of primal fear, Emily broke free. She turned and bolted for the door, nearly tripping over her own feet as she fled down the hallway. Behind her, she could hear the sound of Margot's chair scraping against the floor, followed by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the entire mansion. The shadows seemed to chase her as she descended the staircase, their tendrils licking at her heels. She stumbled into the foyer, her mind racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get out. She had to escape before the house swallowed her whole. Just as she reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, the locks clicking into place. She was trapped. A chilling wind swept through the foyer, extinguishing the few remaining lights and plunging the mansion into darkness. The house groaned again, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from its very foundations. And then, the voice returned. "Emily!" But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a growl. The growl seemed to come from all around her, vibrating through the walls, seeping into her bones. Emily stood frozen, her back pressed against the front door, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. She could hear the slow, deliberate scraping of footsteps behind her, moving closer, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. Her heart hammered against her chest, each beat a frantic plea for escape. But there was no escape now. The door wouldn't budge, and the shadows that slithered through the mansion seemed to grow thicker, more alive with each passing second. She had the unmistakable sensation of being hunted. With shaking hands, she reached in her pocket, pulling out her phone. The screen glowed dimly, the battery dangerously low. No signal. The house seemed to devour every connection to the outside world. She fumbled with the phone, hoping, praying, that by some miracle she could call for help. But before she could even dial, the screen flickered and went black, the phone dying in her grasp. The growling grew louder. Slowly, she turned around, her body moving against her will, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread. The foyer was now cloaked in almost complete darkness, the grand staircase barely visible in the gloom. But there at the top of the stairs stood the figure. It was Margot, but it wasn't her anymore. The thing that had once been her aunt stood hunched and broken, its body contorted into unnatural angles. Its head lolled to the side, and its eyes, once human, were now hollow pits of blackness, just like the creature from the parlor. But this was no apparition. This was something worse, something that had claimed Margot's body and twisted it into a grotesque mockery of life. The creature's mouth opened, far wider than any human mouth should, and from deep within its throat came that terrible, low growl, a sound that reverberated through the house like a predator announcing its presence to its prey. Emily couldn't move. Her body was locked in place, rooted by the overwhelming fear that surged through her. The creature began to descend the stairs, each step deliberate, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were struggling to maintain control of its own limbs. Emily, the voice came from the creature, distorted and grotesque. It was Margot's voice, but layered with something else, something ancient and malicious. "You were never meant to leave." The last word sent a shiver of cold terror down her spine. The house was alive. The house wanted her, and whatever had taken Margot had its sights set on Emily now. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, Emily broke free of her paralysis. She turned and bolted down the hallway, the shadows swirling around her, trying to grab at her feet. The air grew colder with every step, and the growling followed her, growing louder, closer. She needed to find another way out, any way out. She ran blindly, her feet pounding against the ancient floorboards, her mind consumed with panic. The house seemed to shift around her, the corridors stretching and twisting into a disorienting labyrinth. Every turn led her deeper into the mansion, away from the front door, away from escape. As she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with a large, imposing door at the end of the hall. It was different from the others, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift under her gaze, their meaning elusive and unsettling. Something about the door felt wrong, but at this point, Emily had no choice. She grasped the cold handle and pushed it open. The room beyond was vast, much larger than it should have been, given the dimensions of the house. It was a grand hall, but unlike the decayed room she had seen before, this one was pristine. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves, filled with ancient tomes and scrolls, and the floor was covered in an elaborate, blood-red rug. In the center of the room stood a long table, and at the far end of it sat a figure. For a moment, Emily's heart leapt with hope. The figure was turned away from her, but they were seated upright, seemingly calm, their hands resting on the table as if waiting for her. Maybe, just maybe, this person could help. Maybe there was someone here who understood what was happening. She stepped into the room, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello? Please, I need help. I don't know what's going on." The figure moved. Its head turned slowly, creaking like old wood, until its face was visible. Emily gasped, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of what she saw. It was her. Her own face stared back at her from across the table, but twisted, aged and withered, with deep lines etched into the skin. Her eyes were dull, lifeless, but filled with a sorrow so deep it almost pulled Emily toward it. The older version of herself opened her mouth to speak, and when she did, her voice was a hollow, fragile whisper. "You can't escape. None of us can." Emily staggered backward, her mind reeling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. She turned to run, but the door she had come through was gone. The room had sealed itself, the walls closing in like the jaws of some great beast. Behind her, the older version of herself rose from the chair, her movements slow and deliberate. "We are all part of the house now," she whispered. "It will take you too. It always does." The room began to change. Dark, pulsating tendrils emerged from the walls, slithering across the floor toward Emily. The air grew thick, almost unbreathable, and the oppressive weight of the house pressed down on her from all sides. The growling returned, louder than before, filling her ears, her mind, her very soul. Desperate, Emily scanned the room, her eyes darting for any means of escape. Her gaze fell on a small, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was out of place, an object of beauty in a room now consumed by darkness. The mirror's surface shimmered faintly, as if calling to her. Without thinking, she ran toward it, the tendrils snapping at her heels. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold glass, and the world exploded into light. The growling ceased. The darkness retreated. Emily felt herself being pulled, not into the house, but out of it, as if the mirror were some kind of portal. The cold, suffocating air of the mansion faded, replaced by warmth and sunlight. Then everything went black. When Emily opened her eyes, she was lying on the ground outside, just beyond the mansion's front gates. The sky was clear, the sun high above her. The mansion loomed in the distance, its windows dark and empty. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? But the scratches on her arms, the dirt under her fingernails, the cold sweat on her skin told her otherwise. She had escaped. But as Emily staggered to her feet, one thought remained, burning at the back of her mind. The house wasn't done with her yet, and somewhere inside its walls, something was waiting for her return. Emily stood just beyond the wrought iron gates of the mansion, her knees weak and her heart pounding in her chest. The sunlight felt foreign, almost painful after the oppressive darkness she had escaped. She looked down at her trembling hands, the faint marks from the tendrils still visible on her skin like ghostly bruises. The mansion loomed in the distance, silent and still, yet she could feel its eyes on her. Watching, waiting. She should leave, run, and never return. But something kept her rooted to the spot. The house had let her go, but it was as if an invisible thread still connected her to it, pulling at her, beckoning her to come back. "You can't escape," the voice from inside whispered in her mind. Her own voice, or rather, that twisted version of her, the reflection of what she could become. Emily shivered, a sickening realization sinking in. The house hadn't freed her. It had only allowed her to leave for now. The thought haunted her as she staggered toward her car. The ancient mansion loomed behind her like a specter, its dark windows empty, but she knew better. The house wasn't empty. It was alive, and whatever force had consumed her Aunt Margot was still inside, waiting for its next victim. Her fingers fumbled with the keys as she climbed into her car, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She forced herself to start the engine, the roar of the motor a small comfort in the suffocating silence. With one last glance at the mansion, she pressed the gas pedal, her tires kicking up gravel as she sped away. But as the mansion disappeared from view, that invisible thread tugged harder, and Emily knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The following days passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house's dark presence still clung to her. She returned to her apartment, but her sanctuary no longer felt safe. She would catch glimpses of shadows moving out of the corner of her eye, hear faint whispers late at night, and every so often, she felt that creeping cold, the same chill that had filled the mansion's hallways. Her dreams were worse. Every night, she found herself back in the house, walking through its endless corridors, searching for something, someone. In the dreams, Aunt Margot was always there, her twisted, hollow form appearing at the edges of her vision, beckoning Emily deeper into the house. And always, at the end of the dream, she would see herself, that older, twisted version, waiting for her with dark, empty eyes. Emily tried to go about her life, but the house had sunk its claws into her. Even in daylight, she could feel it, lurking just beyond the edges of reality. She grew more withdrawn, avoiding her friends, her family. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart would lurch, expecting another letter, another message from the house. But it never came. Not yet. It was late one night, as Emily lay in bed, tossing and turning, that she finally realized she couldn't outrun it. The house was calling her back. It wouldn't stop. The dreams, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of it, all leading her toward one inevitable conclusion. She had to return. The decision to go back felt like madness, but deep down, Emily knew it was the only way. She had to face whatever was waiting for her inside the mansion. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. And if she didn't, the house would never let her go. It would consume her, piece by piece, until she became like Margot, a hollow shell of a person, trapped in the darkness forever. Emily packed a small bag, just like she had before, but this time, she didn't feel the same mix of curiosity and trepidation. This time, there was only dread. As she drove the familiar winding roads, The landscape around her grew darker, more oppressive. The trees that lined the road seemed to twist and gnarl, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. The sky, once bright and blue, became a dull, overcast gray, as though the very world was shifting, warping around the mansion's influence. When the towering silhouette of the mansion came into view, her stomach clenched. The air around the estate was thick with tension, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. But the house stood silent, waiting for her. The gate was already open, as if it had been expecting her. Emily parked her car and stepped out, the cold air biting at her skin. The mansion loomed before her, its windows dark and empty, but this time she could feel it more than ever, the malevolent presence that had taken root within its walls. She hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering over the door. The last time she'd stepped through this doorway, the house had almost claimed her. This time it might finish what it started, but there was no turning back. With a deep breath, Emily pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was heavier than before, the shadows deeper, and the silence more oppressive. The mansion had changed. It was no longer just decaying and abandoned. It felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that pressed down on her from all sides. Emily's footsteps echoed through the empty halls, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. The house was watching her. She could feel it. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light felt intentional, as if it were guiding her deeper into its heart. She made her way up the grand staircase, just as she had before, but this time she didn't hesitate. Some terrible truth, was waiting for her at the end, and Emily knew that only by facing it could she finally be free. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched out before her, impossibly long. The door to Aunt Margot's room stood at the end, slightly ajar, the same faint light flickering from within. Emily's hands trembled as she approached. The same sense of dread that had overwhelmed her last time returned, but stronger now. The house was different. Asterisk had changed, and whatever had been lurking in its shadows was ready to show itself. She reached the door, her breath shallow, and pushed it open. The room was exactly as she had left it, except for one thing. A figure sat at the desk, hunched over, just like before. But this time, it wasn't Aunt Margot. It was Emily. The version of herself she had seen in the mirror, the twisted, hollow version, sat at the desk, scribbling frantically on a sheet of paper, just as Margot had. The scratching of the quill was the only sound in the room. Emily stepped forward, her legs trembling. The figure didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she could hear it. Her own voice, whispering something under its breath, over and over. As she drew closer, she could finally make out the words. "You were always meant to come back. Always meant to be here." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached out, desperate to stop this nightmare, to understand what was happening. But just as her fingers brushed the figure's shoulder, it turned. The face that met her gaze wasn't her own. It was Margot. With a twisted grin, Margot spoke. "You were never meant to leave." And with that, the darkness closed in. The darkness swallowed Emily whole, an overwhelming abyss that stole her breath, her thoughts, and even her sense of time. It was as if the house itself had consumed her, dragging her into its core, where the boundaries of reality twisted and warped. She felt weightless, suspended in a void, yet every nerve in her body screamed with terror. Then, like a sharp intake of breath, the darkness parted. Emily found herself standing in a room she didn't recognize. It wasn't decayed or shrouded in shadows like the rest of the mansion. This room was immaculate, grand and elegant, as if it had been frozen in time. The walls were adorned with ornate paintings, the furniture polished and gleaming. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals casting a soft glow across the space. But the room wasn't empty. At the center of the room stood a long dining table, and seated around it were people. No, not people. Figures. They sat motionless, their faces obscured by shadows, but Emily could sense something deeply wrong about them. Their heads were bowed, their hands clasped in front of them, as if waiting for something or someone. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room, her eyes drawn to the figure at the head of the table. Aunt Margot. She sat upright, regal, her face now fully visible in the flickering light. Gone was the twisted, grotesque version of her Emily had seen before. This Margot looked almost serene, but there was something cold and calculating in her eyes. Something ancient. Her hands rested on the table, still and poised, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Emily," Margot said softly, her voice clear and sharp, cutting through the heavy silence. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The air in the room felt thick, as if it were pressing down on her chest. Margot smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill through Emily's bones. "You've come back just as you were always meant to," Margot continued, her voice calm, almost soothing. "You felt it, didn't you? The pull of the house, the way it reaches into you, deep inside where you can't escape." Emily swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. "Well, what is this place? What are you?" Margot's smile widened. "This house is more than just a place, Emily. It's a living thing, a vessel. It feeds on us, on our memories, our fears, our very souls. And now, it has you." "No," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not staying here. I won't let it take me." But Margot shook her head slowly, as if pitying her. "You don't understand, Emily. The moment you cross the threshold that began, the house doesn't let go. It never does." Emily's mind raced, the weight of Margot's words sinking in. The dreams, the whispers, the shadows, they had all been part of the house's plan. It had marked her, just as it had marked Margot. And now, it was trying to claim her. "I can't stay," Emily said, her voice stronger now, though fear still coursed through her veins. "I have to leave. There has to be a way out." Margot's eyes darkened, her expression hardening. "There is no leaving, Emily. Not really. You can run, you can hide, but the house will find you. It will call you back again and again until you have nothing left, just like the others." At this, Margot gestured to the figures seated around the table. Emily's eyes widened in horror as the shadows lifted slightly, revealing their faces. They were all twisted, hollow versions of people, just like the figures she had seen in the mirror. Each of them wore a blank, expressionless face, their eyes lifeless, their skin stretched taut over gaunt, skeletal forms. One of the figures turned slightly, and Emily recoiled. It was a woman, her face distorted, but still faintly recognizable, one of her distant relatives. A cousin, perhaps? Someone from the old family stories. Another figure shifted, a man this time, his face contorted with age and despair. These were the lost members of her family, the ones who had vanished over the years, the ones who had been claimed by the house. "I tried to warn you," Margot said softly, almost gently. "I tried to give you a chance to learn the truth before it was too late. But you've come too far now. You're part of it. The house won't stop until it has you." Emily's heart raced, panic rising like bile in her throat. "No," she said, shaking her head. "There has to be a way. There has to be." Margot rose slowly from her chair, her eyes never leaving Emily's. "The only way out," she said, "is to give the house what it wants." Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What does it want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margot's smile faded. "It wants you, your soul, your essence. It wants you to become part of it, just as I have, just as all of us have." The room seemed to close in on Emily, the weight of the house pressing down on her. She took a step back, her mind racing for a solution, for a way to escape this nightmare. But the truth was suffocating her. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It was feeding off her, off all of them, and there was no way to outrun it. But then, in the midst of her panic, a thought flickered in her mind. Something Margot had said before. Asterisk, the house won't stop until it has you, asterisk. What if the only way to beat the house was to defy it? To refuse to give it what it wanted? Emily's pulse quickened. It was a desperate thought, but it was all she had. She turned to Margot, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "No," she said firmly. "I won't give it what it wants. I won't let it take me." Margot's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "You can't fight it, Emily. No one ever has." Emily stepped back toward the door, her resolve hardening. "I'm not staying here," she said. "I'm leaving, and you can't stop me." The house seemed to groan in response, its walls trembling as if in anger. The figures at the table stirred, their hollow eyes following her every move. "You can't run," Margot warned, her voice rising. "You'll never escape." But Emily didn't listen. She turned and bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows thickening, reaching for her. But she pushed forward, her eyes locked on the doorway. As she burst through the door, the house howled, a terrible, guttural sound that echoed through the halls. The ground beneath her feet shook, the walls trembling, as if the very foundations of the mansion were collapsing. But Emily didn't stop. She ran, her lungs burning, her legs trembling. But she refused to let the house win. The front door loomed ahead of her, open and waiting, the faint light of dawn creeping in through the crack. With one final burst of energy, Emily lunged for the door, throwing it open. The cold air hit her like a wave, and she stumbled forward, collapsing onto the ground outside. The mansion behind her groaned and creaked, the shadows writhing. But she was out. She was free. For a long moment, she lay there, gasping for breath, her body shaking. She could feel the house's presence still, looming just behind her, angry and restless. But it couldn't reach her here. Not yet. Slowly, she rose to her feet and looked back at the mansion. Its dark windows stared back at her, silent and unmoving. But Emily knew the truth. The house wasn't done with her. It would never be done. But for now, she had escaped, and she would never come back. As Emily turned and walked away, the house stood still, waiting. Waiting for the next soul to come knocking. Waiting for its next victim.